partner with governments and local communities to basically take on the restoration of protected areas that have not had the resources in the past.
In the 1960s, people called this place the spot where Noah's Ark came to rest. A national park in the heart of Mozambique so thick with life that tens of thousands of large animals moved across its floodplains at the same time. Lions in numbers you could build a whole tourist camp around. Elephants, buffalo, hippos jammed into the rivers, zebra and antelope herds so vast that visitors swore they were looking at the Serengeti. By reputation, it was one of the finest wildlife parks on the entire African continent. And then human beings emptied it. Over 15 years of civil war, armies turned the park into a battlefield, a barracks, and a butcher's shop. Elephants were gunned down so their ivory could be sold for weapons. Animals were shot by the thousand just to feed soldiers. And when the fighting finally stopped and biologists could climb into a small plane and count what was left, the number they came back with didn't feel real. More than 90% of the park's large animals, gone. Not moved, not hiding, gone. Some species were down to a few dozen survivors. Others had vanished from the park completely. The ark everyone had bragged about had been stripped down to an empty stage. Now here is why you need to stay to the end of this one. Because what happened next is not just a comeback. It is one of the strangest things ecologists have ever been allowed to watch in real time. An entire dead ecosystem clawing its way back from less than a tenth of itself. A recovery that only worked because someone made a bet that sounds completely backwards. And buried inside it, a discovery so unsettling that scientists describe it as watching evolution happen in front of their eyes. The war literally rewrote the bodies of the animals being born. I'll get to that. But to feel how impossible the comeback is, you first have to stand in the wreckage of what the war left behind. The Ark, and the day someone finally counted it. Gorongosa National Park sits at the southern tip of Africa's Great Rift Valley. A broad floodplain fed by rivers pouring down off a nearby mountain, flooding and drying on a seasonal rhythm that throws up a pulse of grass and water rich enough to feed staggering numbers of animals. In its mid-century prime, it was a crown jewel. The old aerial counts logged thousands upon thousands of large animals, huge herds of buffalo and wildebeest, hundreds of elephants, hippos packed snout to tail in the rivers, lions, leopards, zebra, waterbuck spread across the plains as far as you could see. Tourists flew in from all over the world just to look at it. And then, starting in the mid-1970s, the whole country was torn apart. First by the war for independence from Portugal, and then by a long, grinding, merciless civil war that swallowed Mozambique whole. Gorongosa sat in a strategically vital spot, and so it didn't just suffer the war off in the distance, it became the war. War is catastrophic for wildlife in ways that go far beyond a few stray bullets. The park turned into a base, a battlefield, and a pantry all at the same time. Armed groups operated inside it for years on end, and the animals were hit from every direction at once. Elephants killed for ivory to fund the fighting, the same grim pattern that played out across conflict zones all over Africa. Buffalo, hippo, zebra, and antelope shot in enormous numbers, season after season, just to put meat in front of hungry soldiers. The big cats, robbed of their prey and hunted themselves, collapsed right alongside everything they used to eat. And even when the Civil War officially ended in the early 1990s, the killing didn't politely stop with it. In the broke, desperate, lawless years that followed, the hunting for meat and ivory simply rolled on. So when biologists finally got up in that plane and ran proper surveys, the picture was near total devastation. Across the large animal species, populations had cratered by well over 90%. Elephants down to a fraction of what they'd been. Lions down to maybe a few dozen. Buffalo and hippo, once in the thousands, reduced to handfuls you could count on your fingers. Some species, the wild dog among them, had effectively been erased from the park altogether. One of Africa's greatest sanctuaries had become an empty stage of grass with almost no actors left standing on it. By every rule we have, a place that broken does not come back. And for a decade, it didn't. And you have to sit for a moment with what that emptiness actually felt like because the numbers don't capture it. Rangers and scientists who walked back into Gorongosa in those years describe a haunting, ringing silence. Floodplains that should have shaken under the hooves of 10,000 animals lay flat and still. The grass grew tall with almost nothing left to eat it. You could drive for hours across country that had once been one of the densest concentrations of big animals in Africa and see a single skittish antelope, or nothing at all. The bones of the old herds bleached in the sun. It was not a wilderness resting. It was a wilderness that had been switched off. If you want to see how it broke that rule and meet the discovery that genuinely rattled the scientists who found it, take 1 second and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel lives for. A place smashed all the way down and then given a real chance to come back.
The bet that sounded completely backwards.
The turning point arrived in the early 2000s, and it came from a direction nobody expected. An American entrepreneur named Greg Carr, a man who had made a fortune in technology and was now hunting for something that actually mattered to pour it into, was introduced to Gorongosa. And what he committed to was not a quick feel-good donation with a photo op attached. It was something far rarer, a long-term partnership with the government of Mozambique, eventually written into a joint agreement to restore and co-manage the park together over a span of decades. Not a year, not a grant cycle, a generation. But here is the part that made it work where so many other rescues had failed. And it sounds at first completely backwards. Carr and his team did not start by pouring the money into animals. They started by pouring it into people. Because they understood something most conservation projects learn too late. You cannot bring the wildlife back while the human beings living right beside the park are desperately poor and see every animal as either a meal or a threat to their crops. You cannot guard a fence line against thousands of hungry families, and frankly, you shouldn't have to. So they did the counterintuitive thing. They built health clinics for communities that had almost no access to medical care. They invested heavily in schools and in girls' education in particular, running programs to keep girls in class and out of early marriage, on the simple logic that healthier, better educated communities take the pressure off the land. High up on Mount Gorongosa, where illegal deforestation was quietly strangling the very rains that feed the floodplain below, they helped farmers grow shade-grown coffee beneath replanted native trees, a crop that rebuilds the forest and pays the people at the very same time. They hired locals as rangers, as staff, as scientists, turning the park over time into one of the largest employers in the whole region. Children of families who had once survived by hunting bushmeat inside the park grew up instead going to its schools, getting treated in its clinics, and in some cases coming back to work for it as adults. That is the slow machinery most documentaries skip right past, because it isn't cinematic, but it is the actual engine of the entire recovery. The whole bet, stripped down, was this: a park can only really be saved if the people next to it have a genuine reason to want it alive. Get that right first, and only then can you start bringing the animals home, the animals that had just been waiting. With that foundation laid, the recovery itself ran on 2 tracks at once. The first was pure protection. Anti-poaching teams were trained and put out into the bush. Ranger patrols were rebuilt from nothing. And for the first time in a generation, the relentless pressure of illegal hunting was finally brought under control. And the instant it was, something quietly astonishing revealed itself. A lot of the survivors had simply been waiting for the killing to stop. Give them safety, and the remnant populations of buffalo, hippo, waterbuck, and especially the tough, fast-breeding antelope started to climb on their own, faster than anyone had dared to hope. The waterbuck in particular came roaring back, eventually into the tens of thousands, into one of the densest populations of the species found anywhere on the continent. The second track was harder. For the species that had been pushed too far down to recover by themselves or wiped out completely, animals had to be physically brought back, translocated in from other parks and reserves around the region and released into Gorongosa to rebuild the missing pieces. And the hardest pieces of all were the hunters. Rebuilding predators is slow, delicate, dangerous work. The lions that had clung on through the war had done something hauntingly cinematic in the empty years. Prides had moved into the abandoned tourist buildings and the gutted ranger outposts, raising their cubs in the ruins of the park's former life, sleeping where visitors once checked in. As protection took hold and the prey herd swelled, those lions slowly began to climb again. And then the project went further, deliberately rebuilding the full cast. African wild dogs, completely gone from the park, were reintroduced in carefully managed packs, and they took to Gorongosa so well it became one of the continent's great wild dog success stories. Leopards, hyenas. One by one, the missing hunters came back, and each one sent fresh ripples through the system, changing where the prey grazed, how the grass grew. The same kind of trophic cascade you see with the wolves of Yellowstone, only playing out here on a flooded African plain. And bringing those missing animals back was not a matter of opening a gate, either. It was a brute logistical gamble in its own right. To restock the park, teams had to dart, crate, and physically haul large, dangerous, stressed-out animals across long distances by truck, and sometimes by air, from other reserves around the region. Buffalo, wildebeest, zebra, elephants, predators, and then turn them loose into a landscape they had never seen, and hope they settled instead of scattering. Every translocation was a risk. An animal can die of the stress of capture alone. But it worked. Year by year, the missing pieces of the puzzle were carried back in and set down on the floodplain. And slowly the empty stage started filling with actors again. The discovery that stopped scientists cold. And all of this was happening under a microscope, which is what makes Gorongosa truly unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. The project built a major research and biodiversity center and pulled in scientists from all over the world, so the entire park became a living laboratory. A place where you could actually watch, in hard data, how a shattered ecosystem reassembles itself. The forests and the slopes of the mountain kept coughing up species entirely new to science. Insects, bats, and other small creatures that had never been formally described. A quiet reminder of just how much life a recovering wilderness can still be holding in the dark. The food web kept rebuilding in ways nobody had scripted. With the big cats slow to return, the antelope at first ran riot in their absence and started reshaping the vegetation in patterns the park had never recorded before. And researchers got to track in real time how the gradual comeback of the predators rippled back through the whole system and pulled it toward a new balance. But of everything that came out of that laboratory, one discovery stops people cold, because it is evolution caught in the act. Go back to the war and the elephants. For 15 years, elephants were slaughtered relentlessly for their ivory. But here is the thing. A certain number of female elephants are simply born without tusks. It's a natural trait. They just never grow them. And during the killing, those tuskless females had nothing on their faces worth a poacher's bullet. So while the tusked elephants were wiped out, the tuskless ones survived at far higher rates. And then they did exactly what survivors do. They bred. When researchers later studied the elephants born during and right after the war, they found something extraordinary. An astonishingly high proportion of the females were tuskless, far, far above what you'd ever see in a normal, undisturbed population. In the span of a few decades, human poaching had measurably bent the genetics of an entire elephant population, selecting hard for the one trait that kept them alive. It is one of the clearest examples ever documented of people driving rapid evolution in a large, wild mammal. The war, written directly into the bodies of the animals being born. And it isn't free. Tusks aren't decoration. Elephants use them to dig for water, strip bark, and shape their whole habitat. A generation of elephants missing them touches the land differently. A scar the ecosystem is still quietly working out, even now. The graph that climbed out of the grave. For years, the whole recovery had been an act of faith. Patrols, reintroductions, money, and hope, with no guarantee any of it would ever add up to anything. The proof, when it finally came from the sky. Every couple of years, scientists fly systematic aerial surveys over the floodplain, tracing set transects and counting every large animal they pass, building one hard, honest number out of the chaos below. And year after year, that number climbed. The herds that had been measured in the pitiful hundreds after the war crossed back into the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Buffalo rebuilt from a remnant into real, thundering herds. Hippo returned to the rivers. Each survey said the same thing in cold, undeniable data. This was not wishful thinking, and it was not a fragile flicker about to wink out. It was an entire ecosystem refilling, measurably, on a timescale of mere decades. And for the people who had given years of their lives to it, watching that graph of life haul itself up out of a hole that deep was the moment they knew, for certain, that the dead park was alive again. what Gorongosa actually proves. Today, Gorongosa is held up as one of the great conservation comebacks of our time, and it has earned every bit of it. The combined large animal population has climbed back from that shattered post-war remnant into the tens of thousands. Elephants cross the floodplain again. Lions hunt in prides that grow year on year. Wild dogs, once completely gone, run in packs once more. Birds, fish, and 1,000 smaller species have followed them back in. And running right alongside the wildlife the whole way is the human story. Hundreds of thousands of people nearby, now employed, treated, educated, and handed a real, tangible stake in keeping the park alive. But the deepest thing this place has to teach is about hope, and it's a hard, clear-eyed kind of hope, not a soft one, because this was no gentle nudge back to health. This was one of the most complete wildlife collapses ever recorded, an ecosystem gutted, deliberately, by years of human violence. And if a park reduced to less than 1/10 of its animals can be brought back to teeming, roaring life inside a few decades, then the honest conclusion is almost hard to believe. Very few places on this entire planet are truly beyond saving. Recovery is possible even after catastrophe. But, and Gorongosa is brutally clear on this, only when it is married to the needs of the people who share the land, and only when somebody is willing to stay not for a year, but for a generation. The ark was emptied by human hands, and then, against every rule we have, it was refilled by human hands too. Gorongosa stands today as living proof of a strange double truth about our own species. We are the only animal capable of destroying a wilderness this completely, and we are also the only animal capable of choosing against all the odds to bring it back from the dead. But not every collapse happens on land where we can watch it unfold. Next time, we're diving beneath the waves, to a coastline that turned into a barren underwater desert, and the single small, furry predator whose return brought an entire ocean forest roaring back to life. What one animal did to a dead coast will completely change the way you look at the sea. Tell me in the comments which half of that double truth you believe more, the destroyer or the rebuilder. I read every single one. Subscribe, and I'll see you under the water.